The Australian Water Association's international program objective is to essentially connect the Australian water technological innovations and expertise with opportunities internationally. We do this through a range of partners, typically the peak water associations in our partner countries, which span across 17 different countries. We have a particular focus on Asia, and the largest program we have is in Vietnam. Particular thanks to the Victorian Government, not only for hosting us today, but for their ongoing support in our activities in Vietnam. But I also must acknowledge our other sponsors, the ANZ Bank, the Australian Government and the Australian Water Partnership. So, why Vietnam? Aside from the Vietnamese people being amongst the most warm and welcoming and hospitable people on the planet, in my view, their economy is growing significantly. They are the second highest GDP growth in emerging markets and the only one with consistently positive export growth. There is an enormous growing middle income, and with this is coming a thirst for many things, including safe drinking water. We're also seeing it become a hugely attractive manufacturing country as for example, cost of doing business in China rises. Many industry is moving down to Vietnam and into Southeast Asia. The Australian Government's relationship, and Australian generally, relationship with Vietnam is also changing from one of aid to one to trade. And the Australian Government particularly is in that transition, and the role of the AWA is to essentially support the Australian Government transition from a predominant relationship to a trade relationship, and we do that through a range of activities which I'll touch on today. Vietnam's water sector requires huge investment going forward, well beyond that of the government. Now, with the aid or donor agencies withdrawing, many have already, and those that haven't have an exit strategy. There is a huge interest in other forms of revenue, particularly from the private sector. So in recent years we've seen the central government come out with some very strong and ambitious targets to enable private sector participation in both capital, technological innovation and expertise. Decree 17 is but one example that essentially enables foreign investment and foreign participation across the economy, but particularly in water. Ease of doing business is rapidly improving in Vietnam, and according to the World Bank's ease of doing business rankings, Vietnam jumped 17 places in the last year and now is ahead of countries such as Malaysia and the Philippines. There is also, in our view, a significant trust in Australian water technological innovation and expertise. And to point to one example, and for those of you that have been to Vietnam, you'll see large billboards promoting the brand Kangaroo, which is perhaps the largest water treatment technology manufacturer or provider in Vietnam. It's a Taiwanese-based company that with their logo, which is characteristically like that you'd see on the rear tail of a Qantas aeroplane. Look, the Australian Water Association has a range of partners, but three in particular I'll mention today who have had a long association with, and one is the Vietnam Water Supply and Sewerage Association, who are essentially AWA's counterpart in Vietnam. And I must acknowledge Anne, who is AWA's international coordinator. Her father is the chair of the South or the North East section of the Vietnam Water Supply and Sewerage Association, and also the chair and CEO of Quang Ninh Water Company, one of the largest water utilities in Vietnam. So our approach at AWA is to essentially leverage aid and facilitate trade outcomes. Our members domestically operate both in the aid and trade spectrum, and we at AWA facilitate on behalf of our members opportunities through Australian Government aid and our other partners and promote the innovations and expertise through those aid activities and drive trade outcomes. I'd just like to touch on a few of the targets, and highly ambitious targets, that have been set by the Vietnam government at the central level. And I do this because I think there's a bit in it for everyone in the room, and everyone across our membership at AWA and the Australian water sector. Drinking water quality. Now, by 2030, 95% of the water utilities have been set a target of achieving drinking water quality. At the moment, there's only one water utility in Vietnam that claim drinking water, and that's Hue, who coincidentally are twinning with Water Corporation under our water utility improvement program. I say this because there's huge investment going into this particular area by the central government, but also by the private sector, to achieve drinking water quality from the tap. Wastewater. At the moment, about 10% of Vietnam's wastewater is treated, which means 90% is discharged directly into the waterways, principally the Red River and the Mekong River, which are typically the water sources that are the extraction point for Vietnam's drinking water, or water supply. They have very ambitious targets for increasing the level of wastewater, and by 2030 they aim to achieve 50% wastewater treatment. Non-revenue water. Now, it spans from highly performing utilities such as the water utility that One on Water are twinning with, and Gary, correct me, 8% non-revenue water, is that about?
Less than 7.
Less than 7, which is probably far better than some of the Australian water utilities, but they are a rare example and obviously one of the best. On the other extreme, it goes up to 70%, and the average, I think, is around 30-something%. So there's some very ambitious targets for reducing non-revenue water and stopping the leaks both ways, in and out of the water reticulation network. Trade waste. Now, as we see significant growth in international industrial parks, but also generally international or industry growing significantly in Vietnam, commensurate with that is obviously increasing load discharge of very nasty trade waste, which the target for 2030 is 100% of all that trade waste is treated. Now, at the same time, we are seeing a very strong process of equitisation, and the target the central government of Vietnam has placed on their ambition for achieving equitisation of all utilities by 2020. Now, equitisation is what you might consider privatisation or part privatisation, but we are seeing significant reforms to enable the private sector to play a role, including foreign investment in water utilities and participation in a range of forms, particularly public-private partnerships. Now, the competition policy reforms that many of you would be familiar with during the national competition policy of the Keating era, 1994 to 2004, are very similar objectives that the Vietnam government are now pursuing. Things such as competitive neutrality, corporatisation of utilities, full cost recovery, economic regulation, to name a few. So the point I'd like to make there is that there's not only opportunity for those technology companies and consultants, but for those that have particular skills in competition policy reforms and economic regulation and policy development. Now, the last point there is technology innovation. There is a huge thirst and desire to develop Vietnam's innovative capabilities, and a very strong interest in partnering with Australian firms to do that. And later on in the presentation, you'll hear from another of AWA's partners in Vietnam, the Ministry of Science and Technology and the Vietnam Climate Innovation Centre. Mr. Nguyen will provide a coverage on that. So I'll just run through a few of the activities that AWA is doing or has delivered or facilitated in Vietnam in the context of how we leverage aid for trade. Now, we have been working at the central government level in strengthening governance and regulation, principally to enable private sector participation. And we've done a range of activities connecting Australian policy expertise with the central government and certainly the local government. And there will be a paper circulated that's printed out that I'll leave on the table afterwards. But the key author of this particular paper, which draws on a lot of our work in Vietnam, is Mike Woolston from Frontier Economics. Mike, are you in the room? And the ANZ Bank, Celastaris, and I must, Andrew, if you could just put up your hand for a second. Obviously, Andrew's not Stellasaurus, but in our view, Stella is one of the world's leading experts in PPPs and particularly structured finance. So please reach out to Mike and Andrew for further information, and the paper will be made available today. But to give you an example of the connections and promotions that we can offer, this has been published not only in Australia but also across Vietnam, this paper. At the central level, we have been facilitating expertise from Australia to support with one of Vietnam's first PPP water utilities, and that is a PPP for Nam Dinh Water Utility, which is in the northwest area of Vietnam, just a little north-south of Hanoi by a couple of hours. Look, it was quite a journey, and a lot of lessons were learnt, which I'm sure Mike will be able to share with you. But I just throw this up there as an example of Vietnam's real desire to pursue PPPs, and that they are real opportunities. But on a technological front, one of the costings we did, and you could probably see this is the traditional water treatment system that you'll see across Vietnam, very large concrete structures with sand filters and chlorination systems. We did a cost comparison between the cost for building these large sand filters and chlorination systems, which don't deliver drinking water, but they'll deliver what they call QCO2 water quality standards, which is clean water but not fit for drinking in what you'd consider the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines context. So with the support of Evoqua, and in particular Bruce Biltoft, we compared the cost of that versus a rack of ultrafiltration membranes. We determined that for a very similar price we could achieve drinking water standards, or for the same price we could achieve, or for a much less price we could achieve the same QCO2 standards for far cheaper. So our approach, and one of the examples of our approach in Vietnam, is to build confidence and capacity of the locals so that they can start to understand things like membrane technology and have the confidence to invest in that and operate that in the long run. Now, a large part of AWA's work is funded by the Australian Government, the Department of Foreign Affairs in Vietnam, where they have a particular objective of increasing access to safe drinking water in rural and remote areas. And AWA has been working in 4 provinces called Dong Thap, Can Hoa, Nam Dinh and Son La. And what we do there is put in very small scale or small to medium scale drinking water systems in areas where it's not technologically viable or economically feasible to run a centralised pipe system, typically in areas where the customer base is less than 10,000 and the cost effectiveness of running a pipeline just doesn't stack up in terms of cost recovery. So in this example, we have just returned from Dong Thap, which is a couple of hour drive west of Ho Chi Minh City on the border of Cambodia, and with several Victorian companies. But this is an example of the source water. The technology, is there a... Ooh. Sorry. The second photo is the technology, which I won't go into too much detail because Mark and Ken from Voctech and Hydroscience were the technology providers in this case, but essentially it involved screening, ultrafiltration, activated carbon chlorination under an automated system that is really simple to operate yet highly advanced technology, providing drinking water quality. Now, another key Victorian based company and one of Australia's, if not the world's leading laboratory companies, ALS, provided the independent verification on the water quality results against Vietnam drinking water guidelines, which showed compliance. So the photo on the very far side is during the launch of the system, where we have the children drinking straight from the tap for the first time, and I've got to say it's quite a rewarding experience to see the faces of the children drinking water from the tap for the first time. Wrapped around this, we also provide water quality analytical equipment, PAC Spectros and Lumen Ultra's bacteria analyzer, which Arthur's in the room, I understand, and please reach out and have a chat with them. But we simply do not just chuck in technology and walk away, but we wrap around it a program of capacity building and support. I've got to say the recipe for success in this project is the partnership between Voctech and Hydroscience and their local manufacturing in Ho Chi Minh City, where they train some very competent local staff, but I won't steal Ken's thunder. Sonlar, we also do similar systems, but using, in this instance, slightly different technology. So our approach is fit for use. So we understand the source water quality. We obviously want to achieve drinking water, and we put in the most cost-effective technology to achieve that. In this case, it was vocal membranes provided by Skyjuice, but also complemented by Hydromet. This site had particular issues with bacteria and calcium. Now, the ultrafiltration membranes were quite cost effective at pulling out the bacteria, and the Hydromet system was very cost effective in dealing with the calcium. I understand Hydromet, is there Adrian in the room? Please reach out to Adrian and have a chat with him about that. But so the unique thing about this particular system and the previous system is financial sustainability. And if you can see the kiosk picture up here, the locals essentially sell the water. It's operated by two women from our other MOU partners, the Vietnam Women's Union, who are 17 million members across Vietnam and a very, very powerful lobby group. Their local representatives operate this kiosk. They sell the 20-litre bottles of drinking water for about 5,000 Vietnam dong, which is a hell of a lot cheaper than what they currently pay for importing the bottled water, and they make a little bit of a return, which they cover all the operation maintenance costs and sink into extending other similar type projects in other areas of most need. We also did a simple system at the school, which is on the far right photo. Canhua is another project, again using, this was ultrafiltration membranes in 2 schools, which essentially provide a couple of thousand kids drinking water every day. Again, Bruce and Arthur came up and provided the independent verification of the results, and we provided training, capacity building on the use of the water quality analytical equipment and operation of it. But to give you an example of the aid trade leveraging, our very good friend, Vice Chair, Mr Tien, the Vice Chair of the People's Committee, has requested another 10 of these as soon as possible to basically fit into the other 10 rural schools that currently don't have access to drinking water, and more than willing to finance those themselves. A water utility improvement program is essentially to connect in this case, 5 Australian water utilities with 5 Vietnam water utilities, where there is a reciprocal exchange of personnel over a period of a couple of years, where they focus on knowledge transfer on critical issues such as asset management, water quality, and a few other areas. Another component to our program is building capacity in water quality, and I won't stick on this for too long, other than to say this. On the right-hand side are the Vietnam QCO2 water quality guidelines, which most of the water utilities in Vietnam currently aim for or deliver. But what you can see, there's 14 parameters compared to the Australian drinking water guidelines, which David, I'm sure you will be able to touch on a little bit more. That kind of gives an indication of the radical transition, where they've come from to where they're going, and where they're going is not unsimilar to where Australia's at in terms of our risk management approach. But in that context, AWA facilitates workshops, and this photo here is a water quality workshop we held at Vietwater in 2015. The photo above that is a photo from One on Water, who donated 13 small spectrometers to, in this case, Nam Ding Water Company, and provided training on their use. The next photo is that of Servolec technology installed in Nam Ding Water Utility to help essentially monitor the water quality real time coming from the pipe, which is a radical upgrade from the army of soldiers they'd send out to collect grab samples at the end of the pipe. So that's kind of where they're at, is transitioning from the end of pipe QCO2 testing to full risk management, so that they can provide assurance that customers are getting drinking from the tap. So Ozwater and Vietwater are the principal platforms for our trade objectives, and we've brought over the last 4 or 5 years now significant Vietnam delegations down to Ozwater. For those that have been, you've probably seen quite a number of Vietnamese running around the pavilion. This year, over the last 4 years, we've exceeded 300 Vietnamese water professionals joining our activities at Ozwater, and this will be the 4th Australian delegation to Vietwater, which is growing each year. Our first year was in 2015, which had around 40 or 50 delegates. Last year we had 100 water professionals, or just under. We expect a similar amount this year, not just private sector companies, but the utilities and a whole range of others, including the Australian Government. We also have our Women of Water program, with a particular focus of connecting leading women from Vietnam and Australia, women and men from Vietnam and Australia, to support the Australian Government's gender program, but also something that's very dear to AWA's heart, and that's our Channeling Change program, which is principally about empowering women in the water sector and embracing diversity in all its forms. So we've held Women of Water workshops at Ozwater and Vietwater over the last few years, and there's a few photos there, but last year we were privileged to have Elise Coghlan from Trade Victoria speak very proudly on the activities of the Victorian Government and in your pursuit of gender empowerment in not just the government but generally. Look, things to consider before heading to Vietnam. I'll just go through these very quickly, and perhaps worth a conversation afterwards, but I encourage you to really think hard before you go what you're seeking from Vietnam, who can help you. Local partners are critical, and I think it's a key message you'll hear from many of the speakers today, and a prime example of the benefits of a local partner is what you'll hear from Mark and Ken from Aquatech and Hydroscience. Who's in the market for your services, what's the value proposition of your services. Get to know your fellow delegates. Over the last few years there's been a really, really positive dynamic, not only do individual delegates pursue their own interests, but we see many referrals between the Australians, and I think Mark's got an interesting example where Avoca were approached and didn't have the precise gear that was wanted by the Vietnam company, and knew that Hydroscience and Aquatech did, and there was a kind referral there, which I think has matured into something that Mark can update you on today. Relationships are critical. It'll be a common theme you hear all throughout today, but this takes time, and in Vietnam, if you don't take the time to build those relationships, then forget about it. So on that note, thank you very much.